I've been writing big non-fiction investigations of historical mysteries for more than 20 years. But I reached a point where I wanted to branch out and take my creative and writing gifts, such as they are, in a different direction. And I felt very strongly that fiction would be an appropriate vehicle in which to wrap up an exploration of really some extraordinary ideas. Now, Entangled is a story of a battle of good against evil, but it's played out over a vast span of time. Basically, this is a time slip or a time travel novel. We have two heroines, two young women who are the heroes of this story. One of them living 24,000 years ago in the Stone Age, and her name is Rhea. She's an anatomically modern human, just like you and I, but she lives at the time of the last Neanderthals, those mysterious, archaic cousins of ours who disappeared, became extinct about 24,000 years ago. This is the time that my young heroine, Rhea, lives. The other heroine of the story lives today in modern Los Angeles, and her name is Leonie. And both Rhea and Leonie are brought together by supernatural forces to do battle with a demon who travels through time and who seeks to mislead humanity, to steer us away from our true path of goodness and light and beauty, and steer us towards misery and destruction and evil and wickedness. And the whole concept of the novel is based on a very different idea of time than the one that we normally work with in our daily lives. Time in this novel is not an arrow that goes straight from past through present to future, where cause and effect can only work in one direction. Time, as I conceive of it, is more like a huge knotted ball of string in which different time periods intersect and cross over one another and can bear influence upon one another. In fact, it's a very quantum physics view of time, and the latest research in quantum physics is suggesting that cause and effect in time can work in many different directions. It doesn't only have to be from the past through the present to the future. It can also be that things we do now can change the past. In other words, time is very mysterious. And at the heart of this story is the fate of the Neanderthals, who the human characters call the Uglies. The Neanderthals, as I describe them in Entangled, are creatures, by all means, physically very different from us, but they are filled with beauty and truth and light and joy. They don't speak out loud, but they communicate telepathically. They have extraordinary healing powers. They use their abilities only for goodness. And this is why the demonic character in my novel, whose name is Sulpa and who's fully manifest in the Stone Age 24,000 years ago, wants to mislead human beings into destroying the Neanderthals, because it's by the destruction of beauty and truth and goodness that this demon gains power, and he is seeking to gain a sufficient psychic charge to jump forward into the 21st century, into our time, and to manifest fully in a human body in the 21st century and weave the doom of all mankind. And he can only be stopped by these two young women, one living in the Stone Age, one living today, who are the central characters in my story. And that is a quick outline of the Tangled story of Entangled. Well, there's a very specific reason for that, which is that the inspiration for this story came to me in a most curious way. While I was researching my last non-fiction book, the book called Supernatural: Meetings with the Ancient Teachers of Mankind, which looks into shamanism and the altered states of consciousness in which shamans always do their work. It became necessary for me, as part of my research, to go down to the Amazon and to sit down with shamans in the Amazon and to drink the powerful visionary brew that they call ayahuasca, which means the vine of souls or the vine of the dead.
Mm-hmm.
When you drink this brew, it puts you into a deeply visionary state. You find yourself plunged into a seamlessly convincing parallel universe where you may have encounters with intelligent entities that have messages to communicate to you. And the way that I got the specific inspiration for the story that I've now published as Entangled was in a series of ayahuasca sessions in Brazil back in 2006, where I was given in visionary space a very clear insight into what the story that I would write would be, and I was shown very clearly that the two leading characters would both be young women, troubled young women certainly, but brave and courageous and good-hearted young women who would fight for goodness against the darkness and the evil that confronts them. Now, it's interesting that in the Amazon, this mysterious brew called ayahuasca, which is in fact a mixture of two different plants, it is believed by the shamans of the Amazon that a great intelligence lies behind the brew, and that this intelligence is female. She is, if you like, the divine feminine, the mother goddess of our planet. They call her Our Lady of the Forests in the Amazon, and that she uses the brew as a way to access human consciousness, and that her mission is the guidance of mankind and to bring us out to our true goodness and potential. And this is understood by every culture in the Amazon who works with ayahuasca, that this great female spirit lies behind the brew. And often she will appear to you in the form of a woman, but very often also she will appear in the form of a gigantic serpent. But nobody is in any doubt that she is female. And it was from working with the brew in Brazil and the encounters that I had as a result of that this whole story emerged. And since the spirit that lies behind the brew is believed to be female, I guess I'm not surprised that my two lead characters are both young women. And there indeed we have the tough love mother goddess, who has violence within her as well as goodness. And part of my story is that my two young female characters both have a dark side to their own character, which gradually, as the story progresses, they must learn to deal with and to integrate. There is also a great deal of violence in this story, and I know that some of my readers have been troubled by that. But the only answer that I can give is that I am writing a story of the battle of good against evil. And when we're trying to describe evil and why it must be stopped and why human beings must make the right choices when confronted by evil, it's necessary to depict evil in its full wickedness. And accordingly, I did so in this book. And my two young women characters are literally in a fight for their lives from the moment the first page of the book opens until we reach the end of the book. No, that is not is not clear to me. Now, this novel is in 2 volumes, and I've written and published the first volume, but the second volume I'm working on at the moment. And one of the joys of writing fiction is that I find I do surprise myself as I go along with the story, or rather that the story keeps on surprising me. So the idea that you've put forward there, I don't rule out that something like that will emerge in the final part of the story, but it's not. It's certainly not been central to my concerns at the beginning. These 2 young women are connected because a supernatural being has chosen to connect them. And in my story, she is the Blue Angel. And actually, she's very much modeled on Our Lady of the Forest, on the spirit of ayahuasca from the Amazon. She has selected these 2 young women. It turns out that both of these young women's lives have been damaged by this demonic force. The demonic force is fully present in the Stone Age, but is also present already in the 21st century as a kind of negative influence or a dark cloud that muddles up people's minds. These two young women are the only ones really who can stop him. Well, see, the interesting thing about this story, first of all, I've explained to you the rather unusual way in which the story came to me, and secondly, I was shown really a very clear vision of the Neanderthals and who they were and what they were about, and it's very, very different from the idea of the Neanderthals that we have worked with for certainly the last 50 or 60 years. You know, in fact, in our culture, the word Neanderthal is used as an insult. If you want to insult somebody, you call them a Neanderthal, and it's supposed to bring to mind this notion of a sort of knuckle-dragging, ape-like brute.
Yeah,
and I was shown that the Neanderthals were not that at all, that they were filled with goodness and light, and that's how I've depicted them in the story. Now, it is a genuine mystery in historical and archaeological terms what happened to the Neanderthals. We just don't know what happened to them. It's one of those events in prehistory that is unobserved. They vanish from the record, but we don't know why. To give you a quick sketch on what is known about the Neanderthals, like all human species, and they were a human species, they originally came from Africa. All of us come from Africa. It looks like the ancestors of the Neanderthals left Africa about 300,000 years ago and moved into Europe. This was before the last ice age had even set in. For hundreds of thousands of years, they were the only human species in Europe. When the great ice sheets began to form 125,000 years ago, the Neanderthals were already there. They adapted to the cold. They were the masters of Ice Age Europe. It wasn't until 50,000 years ago that our ancestors, the ancestors of anatomically modern humans, also migrated out of Africa and made their way towards Europe. And there they encountered this other species, closely related but different, the Neanderthals, who were the masters of Ice Age Europe. And it seems that these Neanderthals, although they were in a position of great advantage against our newcomer relatives, instead of wiping us out, they looked after us. They taught us how to live in Ice Age Europe. They shared their knowledge with us. And for tens of thousands of years after that, from 50,000 years ago right through until 24,000 years ago, these two species lived side by side. And then really quite suddenly, in mysterious circumstances, the Neanderthals disappear from the picture. They become extinct. And so it's a mystery. Did they become extinct because human beings wiped them out? Or did they become extinct for some other reason? Well, in my story, it's essential. We have to accept the fact that the Neanderthals became extinct. But the question is, why did they become extinct? If they became extinct because human beings exterminated them, then that means that that the evil force won back in the Stone Age, and that it set mankind on a dark path, which comes to fulfillment in the 21st century. If, on the other hand, the Neanderthals became extinct for another reason, and that human beings were not involved in making them extinct, then the whole story becomes very different. So this is actually the jeopardy and the burden of the novel. Can my two young heroines, working together across the barrier of time, take the necessary steps to prevent the massacre of the Neanderthals by humans? Yes, they still do become extinct, but for another reason. Human wickedness was not the cause of it, and it's that I'm playing with in the story. That possibility could have been one way, could have been another way, and we're just not sure what the answer is. The weird thing is that I started work on this novel in 2006, and at that time there was a very fixed and firm idea about the Neanderthals in 2006. For example, scientists generally believed that there had been no interbreeding between humans and Neanderthals. In my novel, right from the beginning, it's obvious that there's a possibility of interbreeding between humans and Neanderthals. Back in 2006, when I started writing this novel, the Neanderthals were considered to be brutish and thuggish and stupid. But within the last 4 years, and quite a lot of it since I finished writing the novel, a whole lot of new information has come out about the Neanderthals, which has made me realize that whatever the mysterious source of this novel was, it was rooted and grounded in truth. For example, we've now sequenced the Neanderthal genome, and we know for sure that there was interbreeding between Neanderthals and humans, just as I envisaged in the novel. And in fact, 4% of all modern human genes are owed to Neanderthals. In the image that I was given of the Neanderthals, I was shown that they had red hair, and I described them that way in the novel. This new genome work with the Neanderthals has recently revealed that the Neanderthals did indeed have red hair. And in fact, the gene for red hair in modern human populations is a Neanderthal gene. And the latest evidence, which has come out just during October of 2010, has shown beyond any doubt that the Neanderthals, far from their conventional image, were compassionate and loving and gentle creatures, just again as I depict them in the novel. So for example, we have evidence of the elderly, the infirm, the injured, being cared for by Neanderthal communities long after they would have been physically viable without that support, that this was a loving and caring community. So in a strange way, the story that I arrived at through a visionary process that led me to write about the Neanderthals has been borne out and vindicated by recent scientific developments, and that is very mysterious. But what still remains unknown is why the Neanderthals became extinct, and it's around that particular point that the whole jeopardy of my novel Entangled revolves. And it's really interesting why it happened. You see, Fingerprints of the Gods was a huge hit book all around the world. It literally did sell millions of copies. It was a #1 bestseller in many different countries, Japan, Italy, Britain, for example. It was very popular and very successful. And it seems that it was the popularity and success of the book that really annoyed the archaeologists. If the book were simply to be obscure, then they could be silent about it. But when it became popular, then they felt they had to do something about it, because I had, as it were, I had directly stepped into their territory. And I discovered that academic historians and archaeologists and Egyptologists are actually incredibly territorial individuals. They really want you to be a member of their special club before you start making pronouncements about their particular territory. And obviously, as a journalist, which is what my background was in journalism, I was not a member of the special club of archaeologists and historians. And not only that, but not only had I then written a huge book about their subject, but the book actually turned out to be popular, whereas their books were not popular. And this led to a tremendous amount of envy and jealousy and unpleasantness. So I actually really, it became as a surprise to me. I hadn't expected that it would be this way, but an absolute firestorm was unleashed upon my head after the publication of that book. And I really had to spend several years defending myself against the furious attacks of the mainstream academics who simply will not accept that there's any possibility that there could have been a lost civilization, because that is what Fingerprints of the Gods is all about. It's about the possibility of a huge forgotten episode in human history, a great civilization that was wiped out in the cataclysmic events at the end of the last ice age. And for some reason, this idea is just hugely unacceptable to mainstream archaeology. I think because if there's any truth to the idea at all, it turns the whole business of archaeology completely upside down and on its head, in fact. It is a real threat to the world of archaeology. And so I guess looking back on it now with some perspective and some distance, I can understand why they attacked me. But the net effect on me was to make my subsequent non-fiction books more and more heavy-going. I found that I had to write increasingly defensively, always thinking about where the next academic attack would come from, because these academics, they function like propagandists.
Yes.
If they can find a very small error or mistake in your argument or evidence or reasoning, then they will insert a knife blade into that weakness, and they will then endeavor to expand it out and widen it so that they can then claim that all of your work is invalid because you made that mistake. And of course, this is nonsense. No huge work running to hundreds and hundreds of pages can be absolutely right in everything that's stated. Of course, mistakes are made, but that doesn't mean that everything is wrong. But in order to deal with this technique, this propaganda technique, really, that is employed by academics, I found that in subsequent books after Fingerprints of the Gods, I was working very hard to bulletproof every argument, so that I would back up every single statement with at least sort of 10 or 15 academic references, so that they couldn't possibly discredit it in any way. And while that results in a very sound and detailed and well-documented argument, unfortunately, it also results in a boring argument.
Right.
And I came increasingly to resent the defensive posture that I had been forced into as a non-fiction author. And it's one of the reasons why the time is now right for me to write fiction, because by moving into fiction, I can get back to that place of freedom and adventure that I was in when I wrote Fingerprints of the Gods, because I don't have to explain anything to the academics when I write fiction. I don't have to justify anything. If they get uptight or excited or angry about it, I can say, guys, relax, it's just fantasy, And to me, this is a great liberation, actually. To talk about geology, exactly. I mean, yes, this is a very good example, because the work of Robert Schoch and John Anthony West on the geology of the Sphinx is incredibly important work, and it really raises very, very exciting possibilities about the past. And you would have thought that archaeologists would themselves be excited about that here might be the possibility of a new perspective on the past, and a new kind of theory, a new way of understanding the mysteries of the origins of human civilization. But instead of embracing this idea and seeing where they could run with it, the mainstream, as you rightly say, took every opportunity to pour cold water on it, to scorn John and Robert, and to undermine them in every way that they could. And it's very unfortunate that science works this way. I think science has to be open to new and extraordinary ideas and has to allow them to filter through. Whereas, in fact, the academic reaction to the work on the Sphinx has really slowed down progress in this field. And 15 years really have been wasted with unnecessary academic disputes. The geological facts are clear. The Sphinx could not possibly have been built in 2500 BC when the archaeologists say it was built. The precipitation-induced weathering, the rainfall weathering on the Sphinx makes it absolutely certain that it's much, much older. And, that means that there's a lot of problems with Egyptological theories. But it's the theories that need to be changed in the light of the new facts, rather than dismissing the facts, which is what the Egyptologists have done. So it's just a very unfortunate comment on the way that knowledge is handled in our societies, and the way that certain elites and certain powerful groups claim the sole right and responsibility to control particular kinds of knowledge. And in fact, it's part of the broader mind control system in our society as a whole, I would say, because if you control the past, then you can control how people think about the present and about the future. And that's why this is a really serious issue, actually. In fact, I have no doubt about it at all. And firstly, to speak politically, I would like to draw listeners' attention to the issue of what consciousness is. When we look at the human creature, of course we have our bodies, we have our heads, we have our arms, we have our legs, but we are not really our bodies. What we really are, what really defines the human creature, is our consciousness. Our consciousness is the most fundamental, the most sacred, the most sentient, the most intimate, the most personal part of ourselves. You cannot separate a human being off from his or her consciousness. Our consciousness is what makes us human. And having made that statement, I think it's time we realized that one of the last great human rights struggles still remains to be fought, and that is the struggle for sovereignty over consciousness. In America, we've had the civil rights movement, and at the time there was tremendous resistance to the civil rights movement. But now we know that resistance was totally wrong, and that the victories of the civil rights movement have been of tremendous value to American society, and have made America and the world a better place. There was a time, go back to the 1920s, when women didn't have the vote. And the thought of giving women the vote would cause a lot of men to explode with apoplexy. What a terrible idea. It would bring the ruin of society. But women did get the vote, and we now know that society is vastly better and vastly improved, and all our lives are improved because of that. Similarly with gay rights, there was a long time when to be a homosexual was punished criminally, with criminal punishments, and that people had to hide their sexuality from one another and keep secrets. And when the notion came that gays should have equal human rights, again there was a huge reaction against this, and claims that it would bring the structure of our society down about our ears. And again, those claims proved to be completely wrong. The granting of gay rights has been one of the most progressive and important steps for human liberation in our societies in the world today. So we fought all those battles, and those battles have been won, and our society is a better place because of them. But the one battle which still remains to be fought, and which nobody is talking about, is our right as individual adults to sovereignty over our own consciousness. And unfortunately, we live in a society, and I speak particularly of the West here, of the industrialized, wealthy, Western countries, we live in societies that do not allow adults to be sovereign over their own consciousness. I spoke earlier of ayahuasca, the mysterious vine of souls that I went down to the Amazon to drink. Ayahuasca contains dimethyltryptamine, DMT, which is a Schedule I drug in the United States and in Britain. And we can go to prison for many years for taking DMT. In South America, despite the fact that DMT is the active ingredient of ayahuasca, the use of ayahuasca is completely legal and in fact is protected under laws of religious freedom. It's considered to be a fundamental human right to alter our consciousness in this way in order to gain contact with the spirit world. And I think that this is going to be the next step that we have to take in our societies. We have to recognize that the right of adults to explore their own consciousness in the privacy of their own homes or in ceremonial and sacred circles, doing no harm to others, is a fundamental human right, which the state has no business to be interfering with. If I live in a society that does not allow me to be sovereign as an adult over my own consciousness, then actually I can't claim to be sovereign over anything at all. There's no point in going on about the wonders of democracy and freedom, or indeed taking our military forces and imposing democracy on other countries around the world, if we ourselves live in societies that will send us to prison for exploring the miracle and majesty of our own consciousness with time-honored sacred plants that have been in use in human culture for tens of thousands of years. It's an absurd idea, an absurd abuse of human rights that the state, that the government, that the police forces have the right to break down our doors, enter our homes, send us to prison, and ruin our lives simply for exploring responsibly and quietly the miracle of our own consciousness. And this is an issue on which I feel very strongly. It's all got mixed up with the whole thing about the war on drugs. But fundamentally, I believe it is not the state's business to tell an adult what they may or may not do with their own body and their own consciousness.
I agree with you, Graham.
And to take this, yeah, I think it's a really important point, and I think it needs to be seen as a human rights issue. If I choose to explore my consciousness, I believe that that is my right. Of course, the moment I get in the face of other human beings, start causing trouble to other human beings, become disruptive or difficult or dangerous, then it is the business of the state. But we already have laws that deal with that kind of problem in altered states of consciousness. We apply those laws all the time to alcohol. Alcohol is perfectly legal in our societies. People may enjoy it in the privacy of their own homes or in a bar, should they wish to do so. But if they cause trouble to others, then the state will rightfully intervene. And I think this should be the same with all consciousness-altering substances. And this is a human rights struggle, which is the next great human rights struggle that we're going to have to fight, and which fundamentally touches on the kind of society that we live in. Do we live in a society that really wants to encourage freedom of thought, freedom of consciousness, expansion of consciousness, expansion of the imagination, or do we live in a society that wants to systematically shut us down?
Well, see, that's it right there in a nutshell. I mean, they don't want us to be free. That's why they have food out there that calcifies, our pineal gland to where we don't have that higher state of consciousness.
Exactly.
Like, I personally feel that the brain is a transceiver, okay, essentially. And if people would just wake up and realize that they're so much more powerful, that they're incredible beings. And I know that the basis of your book was about time travel. And if they would just realize that their mind, go ahead, Graham.
Well, the basis of the book is about time travel and about consciousness.
Right.
And I very much take the view that the brain is not a generator of consciousness, but a transceiver of consciousness, as you rightly put it. And actually, science cannot state authoritatively anything on this matter because science doesn't even understand what consciousness is. We know we have this thing called consciousness, but we don't understand how this few pounds of jelly inside our skulls can produce emotions, reactions to an incredible symphony, feelings of love, feelings of beauty, feelings of truth. We simply can't explain consciousness. And the general assumption that consciousness is generated by the brain isn't a fact. It's just an opinion by very materialist and reductionist scientists. But all the measurements on which they base that opinion would remain the same if the brain was in fact a transceiver or a receiver of consciousness. Now, with the mainstream scientific model where consciousness is generated by the brain, it's natural for scientists to believe that when we die, when we're brain dead, then it's all over for our consciousness. But this is contradicted by huge numbers of observations, notably, for example, near-death experiences, where the individual is clinically dead but continues to have experiences. And in fact, I pretty much begin my novel Entangled. We get into it in the second and fourth chapters of the novel with a near-death experience of the modern character Leone. You can't explain out-of-body and near-death experiences with the model that says that consciousness is generated by the brain. But you can explain those experiences with the model that says that the brain is a transceiver or receiver of consciousness. And to give an example, if you pick up a brick and throw it through your television screen, you're certainly going to stop the pictures appearing on your television screen, but the signal will still be there. And another receiver would be capable of picking that signal up. And my suggestion is that it's the same with consciousness, that the relationship of the brain to consciousness is rather more like the relationship of a television set to a television signal than it is to a factory making cars. And that's why altered states of consciousness play a really important role in my novel Entangled. Because the way that these two young women get into contact with one another across 24,000 years of time is not through some kind of time machine, but indeed through altered states of consciousness. And it's the use of psilocybin mushrooms in the case of Rhea in the Stone Age, and she's taught how to use them by the Neanderthals. And it's the use of DMT and later on ayahuasca in the Amazon jungle by the modern character Leone that enable these two young women to leave the confines of the physical body and of the material realm and to move freely through time and space. Well, I was, you're referring to a place in the northwest of India called Dwarka, which has a flood legend.
Yes.
There's a tradition at Dwarka of a former civilization, a great city that was submerged in a gigantic flood. And this kind of tradition is actually found all over the world. There are many, many parts of the world. Everybody, of course, has heard the story of Atlantis and of a former great civilization that was destroyed in a gigantic flood and earthquake. But not so many people realize that similar stories are told all around the world. And the story of Dwarka is one of those. Now, I wrote a book called Otherworlds. In order to write that book, I and my wife Santa, who's a photographer, spent 6 years scuba diving all around the world. And Dwarka was one of the places that we scuba dived and found ourselves looking at mysterious underwater ruins that had been flooded by rising sea levels. We followed these traditions in many different parts of the world. In India, not only in the northwest, but also in the southeast, between Sri Lanka and India. We again followed local traditions of a great flood and found ourselves diving on underwater ruins. And my sense is that this is a universal issue, and that we can find submerged structures all around the world. I feel that has been my privilege and my role up to now, is to try to bring this information back into human consciousness. And you're right that it's bringing it back, because it's been there before and we've forgotten it. and I often refer to humanity as a species with amnesia. That we have just forgotten hugely important things about our own past, and we desperately need to recover them if we're to regain sovereignty over ourselves. This is part of the way that the powers that be control us, by keeping us in ignorance, by keeping us in darkness. Undoubtedly, the characters are real. They dictate the story. It's their reactions in real situations that define how the story is going to go. And I actually feel a tremendous responsibility towards my characters and a tremendous commitment to them. They are real people for me in every sense. They're not figments of the imagination. They're characters who I have come to know and love. Well, firstly, I totally agree with you that we are approaching critical mass. And although we seem to live in very dark times with very dark forces at work in the world, there is more and more goodness bubbling up from underneath. And, people are getting together and thinking things through and refusing to be guided and directed in what to think by governments and by authorities. On the issue of technology, for me, the fundamental thing is that our society has tried to mislead us into believing that technology is the answer to all problems. And actually, it's not. I think the greatest sickness of our society comes from the fact that we have progressively severed our connection with spirit. We have been taught to define ourselves purely as producers and consumers of material goods, and the spiritual side of mankind has been horrendously neglected by our society. And this is the change that's going to have to come. We're going to have to reawaken to spirit, and we're going to have to reawaken to the human potential for love. These are the fundamental changes that have to be made in the future. Right now, there is so much fear and hatred and suspicion being generated in the world that we're forgetting that all of us under the skin are the same. We're all human beings, brothers and sisters on this planet, regardless of which country or culture or religion we come from. And when we find individuals who are using fear and hatred and suspicion to divide us, then we shouldn't fall for those traps. We should remember the fundamental dignity and goodness of all human beings, and above all else, we should try to give love. Yes, I do continue to work with ayahuasca. Long past, I started working with ayahuasca because it was of central importance to my research. I've continued working with ayahuasca because it's had a fundamentally transformatory nature on my own life, and has involved me in what I regard as a valuable and worthwhile spiritual discipline. Ayahuasca is extremely mysterious, and there are many different aspects to the ayahuasca experience. At one level, ayahuasca will put you through again and again through a kind of life review process. What happens is that you find yourself looking back on different episodes of your life and the way that you behaved towards fellow human beings. And ayahuasca shows you very painfully and very clearly that you were not always a nice guy, that sometimes you were very nasty to other people, that you behaved arrogantly or coldly or cruelly towards others. And ayahuasca will not allow you any hiding place from the truth about how you behaved.
Right.
And this is why I often speak of ayahuasca as tough love. And I myself have found myself in tears during ayahuasca sessions, and I've witnessed the same process happening to others, because it's very painful to realize the damage and harm that one's own behavior has caused to others. All along you've been pretending to yourself that it was all right, and ayahuasca will show you that it wasn't all right at all. But this painful encounter with the truth about yourself is fundamental to the healing process. Because what ayahuasca is doing when she shows us these truths is she is allowing us to fix things in the future. We can't change the past, but we can become better human beings in the future. And this has been a consistent and continuous theme of my ayahuasca journeys, the kind of teaching lessons being taught to me about what I need to do to make myself a better, more nurturing, more loving, more giving person, and to cut out the toxic and unpleasant aspects of my character. So I find myself involved in an ongoing process of self-improvement as a result of working with ayahuasca. It isn't easy. It's very difficult to change a lifetime of bad habits. But nevertheless, the opportunity is there, and the opportunity to make those changes is there, and step by step, that's what I've been trying to do ever since I started to work with ayahuasca. So this is an element of continuity that I find highly valuable and worthwhile. Now, the second aspect of the ayahuasca experience is the connection with intelligences and entities from other worlds or other realms. You know, the shamans call these realms spirit worlds, but I don't think they're so different from what quantum physicists call parallel universes or parallel dimensions. And these dimensions are inhabited by intelligent, non-physical entities who can reach us on the level of consciousness. Now, of course, if our consciousness is totally tuned into the material world, if we're tuned into channel normal, as it were, if we're in the alert, problem-solving state of consciousness that our society so values, we're never going to have contacts with those beings and entities from other realms and other dimensions. This is why it is essential to alter one's state of consciousness in order to gain contact with these other realms. It doesn't have to be done through visionary plants. There are other techniques available, rhythmic dancing, meditation, even hypnotism, can all help to get into an altered state of consciousness, but an altered state is vital. And once in that altered state, which ayahuasca is incredibly effective at bringing about, you do find yourself in encounters with intelligent, non-human entities. And again, I have found distinct continuities in my experiences over now a period of 7 years of working with ayahuasca. And I have met the same entities again and again and again, and found that certain teachings and lessons have unfolded over a long period of time. But the most distinct and clear example of this was the way that I was given the whole plot and the central characters of my novel Entangled as a result of ayahuasca experiences. Always do their work. It became necessary for me as part of my research to go down to the Amazon and to sit down with shamans in the Amazon and to drink the powerful visionary brew that they call ayahuasca, which means the vine of souls or the vine of the dead. Mm-hmm. When you drink this brew, it puts you into a deeply visionary state. You find yourself plunged into a seamlessly convincing parallel universe where you may have encounters with intelligent entities that have messages to communicate to you. And the way that I got the specific inspiration for the story that I've now published as Entangled was in a series of ayahuasca sessions in Brazil back in 2006, where I was given in visionary space a very clear insight into what the story that I would write would be, and I was shown very clearly that the two leading characters would both be novel, whose name is Sulpa, and who's fully manifest in the Stone Age 24,000 years ago, wants to mislead human beings into destroying the Neanderthals, because it's by the destruction of beauty and truth and goodness that this demon gains power, and he is seeking to gain a sufficient psychic charge to jump forward into the 21st century, into our time, and to manifest fully in a human body in the 21st century and weave the doom of all mankind. And he can only be stopped by these two young women, one living in the Stone Age, one living today, who are the central characters in my story. And that is a quick outline of the tangled story of Entangled. Well, there's a very specific reason for that, which is that the inspiration for this story came to me in a most curious way. While I was researching my last non-fiction book, the book called Supernatural: Meetings with the Ancient Teachers of Mankind, which looks into shamanism and the altered states of consciousness in which shamans. I've been writing non-fiction, big non-fiction investigations of historical mysteries for more than 20 years, but I reached a point where I wanted to branch out and take my creative and writing gifts, such as they are, in a different direction. And I felt very strongly that fiction would be an appropriate vehicle in which to wrap up an exploration of really some extraordinary ideas. Now, Entangled is a story of a battle of good against evil, but it's played out over a vast span of time. Basically, this is a time slip or a time travel novel. We have two heroines, two young women who are the heroes of this story. One of them living 24,000 years ago in the Stone Age, and her name is Rhea. She's an anatomically modern human, just like you and I, but she lives at the time of the last Neanderthals, those mysterious, archaic cousins of ours who disappeared, became extinct about 24,000 years ago. This is the time that my young heroine, Rhea, lives. The other heroine of the story lives today in modern Los Angeles, and her name is Leonie. And both Rhea and Leonie are brought together by supernatural forces to do battle with a demon who travels through time and who seeks to mislead humanity, to steer us away from our true path of goodness and light and beauty, and steer us towards misery and destruction and evil and wickedness. And the whole concept of the novel is based on a very different idea of time than the one that we normally work with in our daily lives. Time in this novel is not an arrow that goes straight from past through present to future, where cause and effect can only work in one direction. Time, as I conceive of it, is more like a huge knotted ball of string in which different time periods intersect and cross over one another and can bear influence upon one another. In fact, it's a very quantum physics view of time, and the latest research in quantum physics is suggesting that cause and effect in time can work in many different directions. It doesn't only have to be from the past through the present to the future. It can also be that things we do now can change the past. In other words, time is very mysterious. And at the heart of this story is the fate of the Neanderthals, who the human characters call the Uglies. The Neanderthals, as I describe them in Entangled, are creatures, by all means, physically very different from us, but they are filled with beauty and truth and light and joy. They don't speak out loud, but they communicate telepathically. They have extraordinary healing powers. They use their abilities only for goodness, and this is why the demonic character in my novel